Well, welcome everybody. I'm Karin Hoskin, the Executive Director of Coho US, and with us tonight is Karen Gimnig. She's the Assistant Director, Communications Director. I don't know. I could throw a bunch of other titles. She's my other half, essentially. So I will plug in our emails in the chat in just a moment. We're happy to be able to offer these web chats. We do have an amazing new website, and I will plug that link into the chat as well. Please take a look at our shiny, new, and improved directory, communities directory. And if your community is new or forming, consider doing our community launch program. Information on how to update or add your directory, your community in the directory, or to launch your community is either on our website, or you're welcome to reach out to Karen or I, and we'll give you all the juicy details. So the plan for tonight, Karen's going to talk for a little while, and then we'll have questions and answers. So she is, besides all the other stuff I said, she's a professional facilitator using the, Karen, do you say the Imago dialogue? Is that how you say the technique? Okay. She'll be moving from East Lake Commons area, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, to somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. I would imagine at some point you'll either be moving into a community or starting one from scratch.
One of those things.
Enough to do that. Anyway, she's going to be talking about conflict as growth, conflict in growth as it's trying to happen. Yes, you go. You tell us.
Okay. I'm gonna share a few slides here, so I can get that started. Okay, so topic tonight is embracing conflict, or as Karin said, part of the Imago relationships frame is that we think of conflict as growth trying to happen. So I'm going to talk some about what that means. I think that one of the challenges of web chats is that the sort of juicy topics that we like to get into really need more than 15 minutes or an hour to do well. So just noting that there's way more to this topic than is going to fit in tonight. So I'm going to kind of go through a piece of it, and there's certainly more to talk about at other times. But the piece of it I really want to look at tonight is how sort of our culture interfaces with conflict and how our expectations of conflict impact how we experience it and kind of what options we have in that regard. So let's see if I can get my screen to forward. There we go. So looking at conflict and our culture, our mainstream culture, the general message that we come with is conflict is bad. Often the questions that we get around conflict are, how do we avoid it? How do we make sure that conflict never ever happens, because it's terrible and we hate it and it hurts us and we don't like it. And I want to really suggest a different viewpoint about that, which is that conflict is a normal and natural thing. It's to be expected. And the frame that we like to say is that conflict is growth trying to happen. And what I mean by that is that the sort of relationship frame that I find really useful is that all of us reached adulthood, or whatever age we happen to be, without exactly a perfect developmental path, right? Things were missing that we needed or didn't happen when we needed them to, and one way or another there are pieces of us that have a little more developing to do. And conflict is one of the places, and actually I think one of the most effective places, where we become aware of those things, and that it is the relationships with each other that are our most fertile ground for growing them. And so for me, it's really, really important to look at conflict from that perspective. It is a positive thing. That doesn't mean it's a fun thing. That doesn't mean we like it. And it certainly doesn't mean that conflict as it gets uglier is better. But conflict is a normal and natural thing that serves a function for us as humans. and we're really designed for it to be there. And if we can look at it with that expectation of this is going to be useful, this is going to be a good thing, I think we've got a way better chance of getting to the other side of it in a way that builds our relationships and our sense of community, rather than letting that conflict function in the opposite way, which is to sort of break things down and push us apart. So that's really my primary thesis for tonight, is that if we can think of conflict in a positive direction, that's going to help us. And then how do we do that? And how do we as individuals engage in conflict in ways that make that growth more likely? So I think sometimes we use conflict as a synonym for disagreement. And I want to say, I think those things are pretty different. And the significant difference for me is that whereas disagreement is just that, we have different ideas about things. That happens a lot. Conflict is a different thing in that it includes an emotional trigger, right? So I can say, I think raspberries are the best fruit ever. And Karin can totally disagree with me because she thinks some other kind of fruit is the best fruit ever. And we can be in disagreement, but neither one of us is triggered. Neither one of us is emotional or upset about that. We can totally be fine having different opinions about which fruit is the best. And that can even extend to something that might make a difference in our community. So I might think that we should plant the whole garden with raspberry bushes. And Karin might think that that's a terrible idea. We should actually plant blueberry bushes all over the whole thing. And we can disagree about that and either come to a compromise, or Karin can be like, yeah, I'd rather have blueberries, but hey, she's doing it. She can plant her raspberries. I don't care. None of that constitutes conflict, right? Because we're not triggered. Neither one of us is in that emotional trigger space of being upset and engaged really strongly emotionally about it. And what's interesting about that is that it points out, you'll see it in community, typically in communities where there is conflict that we're concerned about, some people are in conflict. Plenty of other people are in disagreement. They may not think that proposal is a good idea, but they don't care very much, right? Like it doesn't matter to them because it's not gonna bring the common house crashing down or something, right? Like the end of the world is not going to come over this issue. And some of us know that and are fine, and some of us know that and it is still a huge thing for us. And the difference, I think, is that when we're triggered, it's because it's calling to something that is ready to grow in us. It is bringing up something that we have worked through before and been hurt by before in some way, that's ready to sort of come to the surface and say, okay, you can let go of that a little bit. That intensity doesn't need to be there for you. And we do that through relationships. So I think of conflict as an invitation to growth. Doesn't mean it will happen. Plenty of conflicts happen without growth happening. But I also think of conflict as mutual. It's pretty unusual for one person to get triggered and they just stay triggered and everybody else is perfectly fine. I think typically there's some level of mutual. And even if only one person is triggered, I think the potential for growth is mutual. So if I want to plant raspberries and Karin wants to plant blueberries and Karin just doesn't care, but I want her on my side and I'm just totally triggered by that, odds are not only will I grow through engaging with that with Karin, but also that as she takes the path to work through it with me, that she'll get some growth out of that too. And so it's a growth opportunity on both sides, which is, I think, the really beautiful thing about living as we do in relationship with one another. So why doesn't it work? If we've got this great invitation for growth and we know growth is a good thing, how come we don't end up with growth out of conflict? And I think it again comes back to that mainstream culture that we grew up in, which is a culture of blame a lot of times. So we go to whose fault is it that I'm uncomfortable? Whose fault is it that this thing I don't like is what's happening? We go to judgment, who's wrong, who's right, that kind of thing. We tend to rely on logic. And the trick to the reason that relying on logic doesn't work well in conflict is because conflict, as I said, is about emotional triggers. And emotions don't listen to logic. And so if we just rely on logic and make that the only sort of valid way to talk about it, we're not very likely to get to the sort of core growth space that there's potential for. And then we tend to try and focus on what's right, or we focus on what's fair. And again, none of that is going to address the sort of emotional need that's being expressed when conflict shows up. And I have to tell you, I came into adulthood really good at all this stuff. Show me any situation, I could tell you who was right and who was wrong. I could tell you who was to blame, especially how it wasn't me. I'm really good at this. And it never, I can't think of a single time that it has ever helped me be in better relationship with someone. And so really, if we want to get to the other side of conflict in a positive way, an awful lot of it is noticing that we do these things and accepting that. Like, we were raised to do that. We were taught in our culture that that's the way you address conflict. So notice that and then decide, wait a minute, this isn't going to help me in relationship. It might help me in some kind of power struggle. It might help me in the corporate world, but in community and in relationship, this isn't going to get me where I want to go. Because what we really want when we're in conflict, I think, is this core human need of connection. And I'm a fan of Brene Brown's definition of connection, which is that she defines connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. And what I want you to notice about this connection definition is that while it's about being seen, heard, and valued, there's nothing in it about agreement. We can be in disagreement and in very close connection if we are seen, heard, and valued, even in that space of disagreement. So that's what we're aiming for. So how do we get there? I think there are a series of skills that are helpful, and there's probably more than this, but as an overview in the time we have tonight, one of those is curiosity. I think we kind of forget that there are other viewpoints, there are other ways of looking at things. And if we can start with curiosity, so when we first notice, hey, I'm feeling triggered about this. I may not even know that I'm into conflict yet, but inside of me, there's this emotional trigger going on about it. If I can pause and get really curious about myself, why is that so triggering to me? You know, there's 5 other people seeing the same thing I'm seeing and they're not triggered by it. What's going on in me that is bringing that intensity to the situation? And is it useful, and those kinds of things. And then I think to also get curious about the other. So if it's so clear to me that this is the right way to do it, why is this other person, who is also an intelligent, caring person who, you know, is involved in community and values a lot of the things I value, how can they have such a different perspective? And to adopt a space of curiosity really is about letting go of judgment. We just get rid of the who's right and who's wrong and move into, I wonder what's going on here. And that frame is going to be really useful as you then sort of work through this with that other person or other people. The next tool that I think is really important is listening. There are lots of names for that. In the Imago relationships frame, we call it mirroring, which is to repeat back what you've heard. In other disciplines, they call it active listening or reflective listening, and I'm sure there are more terms like that for it. We know from MRI results that when you just ask someone to listen, the part of their brain that turns on is the part that generates information. And that's because when we're asked to listen, what we mostly do is try to figure out how we'll respond. And that turns out not to help us understand the other person very well. If you are asked to listen with the expectation that you will then repeat back what you've heard, mirroring or these other terms for that, the part of the brain that lights up on an MRI machine is the part that takes in information. So it's a whole different piece of how our brain functions. And so when I say listening, certainly we do want you to sort of be quiet and hear, which is what we think of when we think of listening. And I'm going to encourage you to use a mirroring or active listening kind of model where you are repeating it back, because I think you need that part of your brain that takes in information to do this well. And I don't know of a better way to get that part of the brain engaged. The next piece I think that's really important is validation. And that is understanding and respect without agreement. So to be able to say what you're doing makes sense, what your perspective is makes sense to me, even if I don't agree with it. And to be respectful about that. And what that comes down to is that you're not dismissing someone else's viewpoint. I think a lot of us feel like, you know, when someone disagrees with me, I'm not important to them, I'm not valued, and they're dismissing me, not just my ideas, but me as a person. And if you can get to that place of understanding and respect by validating their perspective, turns out to be far less important whether you agree with it if you can validate it. And then the last piece is the empathy piece, which is really about sort of exploring what does it feel like to be in their side of this. We mostly know how we feel on our side, but we don't tend to know what it feels like on the other side, and taking time to just pay attention to that. Because remember, if we're in conflict, we're in that space of emotional trigger. And so sometimes the person we're in conflict with actually isn't making a ton of logical sense because they're being driven by their emotional space. And it's the understanding and connection with that that's going to help us work through that with them. And the other thing I want to point out about this is that very first word on the slide, which is skills. This isn't something I think that you can just decide, oh, I'm in conflict, so now I'm going to be a really good listener. I'm going to turn on my curiosity. I'm going to be really good at validation and empathy. Most of us did not grow up practicing these skills. And I believe it makes a huge difference to practice them early and often. And so I would encourage you to practice them when you're not in conflict. And and also when you're early in a conflict situation. But that early practice when you're not yet in conflict is where you actually get good at the skills. They get harder when you're triggered. The emotional triggers will make all of these things harder to do. So you want to be good at them before that. And my last slide is sometimes you need help. And I think this is, you know, in community, we know this about almost everything. Sometimes we need help, and certainly conflict is a place where that can be true. Often there are community members who get some training in helping with this. And what I want to say about that is I think that training piece is important. And there are lots of places to get training and experience with this. I think in most communities, there's a danger that people start doing this without actual training. There are people who are good at it, or, you know, sort of have this natural sense of it, and people like them, or they get engaged. And having been one of those people, I can tell you I got a whole lot better at helping people with conflict when I got some actual formal training. I think it matters. And I think that trying to help people through conflict can be pretty dicey if you don't have as much skill as you need. So I just have that caution of, it's not necessarily a good idea to just say, okay, who raised their hand? Okay, they'll be the ones we turn to when we've got someone in conflict. Depending on how big the trigger is, that can work or it cannot work. And so you just want to be cautious of that. And then the other place is to get professional support. And I think there are a lot of times that you might want to do that. One is when an outsider is needed, when the conflict has gotten big enough or crossed the community enough that you don't have someone who is unbiased enough or has the skill and is unbiased enough to help work that particular issue. And then another reason is when more skill is needed, when there isn't a community member with the skill needed to address the level of conflict that you have. I also think professional support can be helpful for support of those community helpers. So if you've got someone who usually supports others in conflict, it can be really useful for them to reach out to a professional and say, okay, this is the mess I'm in. How do I, or this is what's going on in my community. How would you propose that I engage in this? And I think that's certainly some of the support that I offer to communities, and I suspect other professionals are willing to as well, on a sort of, you know, that you can do it remotely and get some support. So I think there's sometimes an idea that the only way to get professional support is to pay them to come in for you know, a whole expensive weekend, and that certainly is one way, but sometimes you can get some of their expertise just by reaching out to them for a consult in that way. And the other piece of that I want to talk about is just that I think it's really helpful for communities to have an ongoing relationship with a professional. The reality is that if you call up a professional because you're in deep conflict and it's their first engagement with your community, they're going to spend days getting to know people and getting their feet under them and figuring out sort of what's going on and what the dynamics are, and developing enough trust, because no one trusts them because nobody knows them yet. There's no way that you're going to get the trust you need to work with conflict just because they've got a professional designation. And so they can spend a whole lot of time getting to the point that they can actually be useful. And my theory is that a lot of the time, if you just had an ongoing relationship with a professional, that if, you know, you would have reached out to them earlier, so they're likely to get engaged sooner before it has blown up quite so badly. And also that professional then knows and is known by your community, so that trust element is already in place. And then if they need to come and work a particular crisis or a particular conflict, the time and investment that they'll take is significantly less. So I think sometimes communities say, oh, well, we're not going to have an ongoing relationship with professional process help because it's too expensive and we can't afford it. And then when a conflict crisis comes and they need to bring someone in, they end up spending as much as they would have to have had the support all along. Because it's so much more difficult to walk in sort of new to a crisis kind of situation. So, so those are my thoughts about getting help and when to get it. And with that, I am going to stop and open things up for questions.
Karen, can you hear me?
I can.
I'll get closer. What about the person that is so terrified of conflict they don't even show up in the meeting? Do you go get them? Do you seek them out? Do you just let them be? What do you suggest about that?
Yeah, so the question is, what about the person who's so terrified of conflict that they don't show up at the meeting? And that is actually, I think, pretty common in co-housing. That my experience is that co-housers are more likely to be conflict averse than the general public. And so for that reason, a lot of conflicts get sort of shoved under the rug, and that doesn't tend to be, they don't tend to dissolve there. They tend to hang out and come back and bite you later. And so the answer about the person who is not willing to come to the meeting, my first thing is be cautious of assuming that it's because they're conflict averse. That might be the reason. I tend to guess that it's because in some way they don't feel safe. And that may be because they never feel safe in conflict. It may also be that facilitation hasn't been as skilled as it might be. Or it might be that the person facilitating that meeting is someone that they perceive to be biased against them, or aligned with the person that they're opposed to, or it might be that their mother just died and they just can't handle it right now. Or it might be, right, like there's so many reasons. And so I think the first thing is to try to engage one-on-one with that person, with that space of curiosity and in a very supportive kind of way, and have a really listening conversation. I think one of the things that we do that doesn't work in those situations is that we go to them with an agenda of what we want to tell them. And that may be something you want to do if you want to tell them things, but that's a different meeting than I want to understand what's going on with you. And you may be able to fit both in the same meeting, but you can't just intersperse them in my opinion, just casual conversation trying to do both. They won't feel heard. If they're already triggered and already not feeling safe, they need that safety of being heard and mirrored and mirrored and mirrored and mirrored. And it's really about, I want to take in what's going on with you. and maybe some prompting around, and what can we do to support you, and what will help you with this. And then from there, hopefully you'll have some information to know. Certainly, I think there are cases where people are not in a place to do the kind of work that growth requires. And so they simply aren't going to engage. And again, I encourage you not to go to judgment about that. It's inconvenient, it's unpleasant, we don't like it, that's all okay to be. But the reality is there's a reason that they are not up for that kind of work right now. And we don't always get to know what that reason is. But if in fact they don't have the capacity to do the work, dragging them to a meeting through some sort of pressure or shaming isn't going to make anything better. And I think that happens sometimes in communities. Like, you're a member of our community and there's a problem and it's your responsibility to show up. Well, if they're not, then let's figure out why they're not. And it may be that there is work the community needs to do to make it safer. And it may be that at this moment in their life, their capacity to show up for that kind of work just plain isn't there. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying I like it, but I'm very pragmatic about this. What's likely to make it better? And pressuring them to come to meeting is not on the list of things that I think is likely to make it better.
Thank you.
Oh, so Oak Creek Commons is asking, can I go over the info of which part of the brain is used during taking in info and active listening? And the answer is, I'm not that good a neurologist. So I know that those different pieces exist, but I have not studied brain anatomy in that level of detail to be able to name the particular parts. Oh, it looks like there was more to that. Did you want me to repeat what I had said before?
I'm sorry. Yes, it would be helpful if you just went over that. It was a little fast for me.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Sure, that I'm happy to do.
Okay.
So essentially what we know is that different parts of our brains show up in different ways, and that we have some tendencies about that. And in life, if we are just told to listen, our brains do actually what you might predict if you visited a typical third grade classroom, where you get told to listen and then you're supposed to respond, right? So sit there and listen and then have an answer. And there's a reward for the person who has the answer to the question. That's kind of how our brains work, that if we're just told, listen to this, what we do is think about how to respond to it. And so that's the part of the brain that is trying to create a response that lights up on an MRI in that test case. And it's a whole different part of the brain that takes in information and records it. And that's the part of the brain that turns on if you ask someone to listen with the expectation that they will then repeat back what was said. So if you know you're going to have to repeat back in a mirroring or active listening kind of frame, the part of your brain that actually takes in and records information is the part that turns on. There are a number of studies that look at of what is said to each other in human interactions, how much of that is actually received. And the estimates, depending on which study you look at, are somewhere between 14 and 20% of what is said actually gets taken in on the other side in typical conversations, which is why, again, this mirroring active listening is so important. And what I believe is that if we practice it, this much neurology I do know, which is use it or lose it. The part of your brain that you practice, that you actively use, grows, and the parts of your brain that you use less diminish. And so if you practice mirroring as a regular thing, that part of your brain gets more and more active, and it's more and more present even if you're not mirroring, right? It's just much more part of your life. And so people say, but isn't it so stilted and so stunted? And two answers to that. One is sometimes, and less than you'd think. the better you get at it, the more you can just sort of work it into conversations and people like it. But yes, sometimes it is stilted and stunted. And if you've done a lot of it in practice kinds of spaces and structured conversations, I think your ability to take in information increases even when you're not actually planning to mirror.
Thank you so much, Karen.
You're welcome. That was what you needed?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. And I think we had another question in the chat. What do you recommend to create safety in community where it hasn't existed? Okay, so I need a whole weekend. So some of it depends on why it hasn't existed. And I think, so that's that curiosity piece. Can we get into thinking about, okay, where is this coming from? I do think that adding mirroring practice as a regular part of meetings is really likely to increase safety. I think that sometimes when there hasn't been safety in meetings, it relates to people facilitating meetings who are either perceived as very biased or who don't have great facilitation skills, or perhaps don't have great facilitation skills and therefore are perceived as biased. And so if that's where it comes from, then you need to address that cause, right? So you need meetings that have that happening. I think that, you know, in some communities there isn't safety because there's a gossip pattern going on, right? We might not name that, but that can be a thing. And I think in a case like that, where there's this underlying pattern, you got to figure out how to name it, and not in a judgmental way, but to use a structure. I use a structure called bridging circles that I've done I've presented at conferences a few times, and I'm happy to work with communities on it. It's a structure with a whole lot of mirroring is what it comes down to, where you engage. Okay, so there's a sense that there may be a gossip problem in our community. Let's talk about that in a way that's not, and what you want in that conversation is for people to be heard. Turns out that having someone respond to what you think doesn't increase safety. It's the having it heard and held, hopefully validated and empathized in some way. But to have that opportunity to talk about the thing that doesn't feel safe. And even, and a lot of times communities go to, well, we don't feel safe, so we need a new policy. Well, if we just had a policy that we never are allowed gossip, that's going to solve our problem. And I haven't heard a lot of success stories about that. I'm sure there must be some out there somewhere. But ultimately, it's not the rule that we're trying to change, it's the sense of connection. And so if you can create spaces in which people can express the things that they're concerned about, the things that don't feel safe to them, that's where you begin to heal that safety. I don't have a magic wand. You're not going to change it overnight. If you've got 20 years of conflict in a community, that's a lot to unwind. But I do think you can begin to shift it. And the other thing I'll say is that in general, my belief is that structure is safety. So the less safety you have, the less trust you have, the more structure you need. And that's facilitation structure in meetings, and that's structure in how you structure conversation. You know, if someone's working conflicts and meeting with different people, you're going to want structured conversations for those meetings. But structure is a big help in the realm of safety because people know what to expect, and it helps folks not sort of come off the rails. So that's what I can do in a short answer. There's way more to be said about that. And so this is, could I please repeat about structure and safety? So predictability brings safety, and structure brings predictability. If we know what's coming, if there's some limit on what's going to happen, so we know that we're going to speak in a round at a meeting and each person is going to get a turn, and so I know for sure that I'm going to get a turn, that's going to create safety. If we're going to have a dialogue between two people and we know that we're going to start, this person's going to send and that person's going to receive, and then we will trade places, and and the other one will get a chance to send, that structure is going to create a sense of safety.
Karen, this is Carolyn from Oak Creek Commons. How do you know when someone isn't feeling safe in a meeting? Because oftentimes someone may be generally good at attending meetings, but something has come up that they're not feeling comfortable with, and they may not be participating and you're not sure why, but you don't really give it a lot of thought because you're not aware that they're not feeling safe.
Yeah.
So unless you ask the question, and even then if you do, how can you be sure that is the problem?
Right. So the question is, how do you know if someone's not feeling safe in a meeting? And knowing that they may not say it. So most of us fall into sort of one of two categories about what we do if we're not feeling safe. About in the general population, about half of us get bigger and louder when we're not feeling safe. Those are the ones we know, right? Like those are not the ones we have to figure out about. We usually can figure them out pretty easily. About the other half of us get smaller and quieter and withdrawn when we're not feeling safe. And these are the people you're asking about. And I will say my experience of co-housing is that we have more of those folks in co-housing than in the general population. The tendency in co-housing is more toward when I'm stressed, I get quiet. And so some of it is sort of reading nonverbals and reading the emotional energy in the room. So if you have an instinct or a sense that someone may be distressed, I'd follow that. Like I'd pay attention to that and engage with that. And depending on what the relationship with that person is, or what, it's hard to say exactly what to do, but some options are, you can check with them during, in that moment and say, my sense is you might be distressed, or you haven't spoken in a while, would you like to say something, that kind of thing. You certainly can check with them after the meeting. You're more likely to get an authentic answer one-on-one. Folks who tend to be minimizers are even more likely to be minimizers in a larger group. So checking with them after the meeting is going to be more useful. If you feel like there's a pattern of this, then you're going to want to try and name it. And I have some work I do with couples that really pulls out what are these patterns of the high energy and the lower energy, like how do we engage with folks that go those different ways, and how do we help them understand each other and work well in meetings together. So you can do that. And sometimes the answer is you're just not going to know. If they're just not willing to engage, then they're just not. And you may just not have that. Karen, I saw your question. Did I see Neil's question? So I'm going to go looking for it here. So for established communities who do not have an overt conflict resolution model, how do you suggest they adopt it? For many communities, a community conflict gets directed to a navigator, executive team, group process committee to review and plan an action or make a recommendation to the whole community. Yeah, so it's a two-part question, I think. The first is, do they want to adopt it, right? And that, that's just one of those things of you just got to work through it. And I think the cleanest way to work through it is to speak to your own need. I think that there's a tendency when this comes up for people to say, there's so much conflict here, the community needs, if it was responsible, can you hear all the judgment in those terms that comes right up? And so I think you're more likely to get attention to it if you can frame it as, I'm experiencing discomfort, distress around my experience of conflict, and it would be helpful to me if we could find a way to address it. I think the more it's more vulnerable to show up that way, and you're more likely to get a response. So just really owning where it's coming from. And sometimes, you're the only one feeling it, and maybe it's not a whole community response. Maybe maybe you need an engagement to sort of work through your thing. That's possible. I think it's more likely that the community would benefit, but that's my bias, of course, in the work I do. I think every community could use this kind of help. But in terms of how to adopt it, so say the community gets to a point of, yeah, we know we need this. we're struggling, we've got more conflict than we like, we're not handling it well, we want a way to address it. It's a great time to get a professional involved, I will say. I think most communities do not have the skill set on board. I mean, honestly, if you had the skill set on board, you probably wouldn't get to where you needed it. Like, it's just one of those things. So engaging a professional is definitely a piece of what I would recommend. And then the next thing becomes, how do you form a group? That, because even if you're going to engage a professional, you're going to need a group to get together to decide which professional and to figure out what a budget should look like. And, do we have the capacity as a community to do a whole weekend workshop, or do we need to do it in some other way? All those questions. And I'm actually a big fan of, Laird Schaub did a web chat just a few days ago that you can see on the website, where he talks about a method for selecting a team where high trust is needed. And this is absolutely a case where high trust is needed. And what he says that I 100% agree with is, if the way you select that team is by saying, who wants to be on it? And you take the people who raise their hands, the likelihood that you're going to get a team that has high trust from the community is tiny. There is very little correlation between the people who raise their hands and the people who have the credibility in community to do this kind of work, and often the skill set. I mean, some of those people will raise their hands, but a lot of them won't. And so the question is, how do you get there? And I mostly will just refer you to Laird's web chat from last week and let him explain it in detail. But it comes down to a voting process where you generate a team that's chosen by the community in a secret vote, so that you're not hurting people's feelings. And he has a whole process for also making sure you end up with a team that can work well together, so you don't get people on there that just absolutely can't function well on a team. And that would be the recommendation. The one other thing I'll say about that is, if you, once you have that team, my advice is that that team works together to practice skills, to learn skills, to really build that skill set together as a regular thing. And they may come together to sort of do some community temperature taking. Like, is there a lot of conflict? Is it time for another workshop? Do we, is there something we can bring to meetings that would help overall? What I don't recommend is for the community for that committee as a whole committee to talk about an interpersonal problem between two people, or a problem that one person has brought. My advice is that those committee names be public. Obviously the community should know who's there. And when a person is in distress, they can reach out to any member of that committee, and that member will keep that conversation confidential. If they feel like they need help, they can certainly say to the person in distress, I don't know that I can handle this. Is it okay if I invite Sally into it? And with that permission, certainly. You don't have to go it alone, but the idea that if I report to Neil, who's on this team, that I'm in distress, and the result of that is Neil's going to get together with these 6 or 8 other people, and they're all going to talk about me while I'm not there, we definitely have a safety problem. So yeah, so that's what I would say about establishing it. But the thing about getting professional help, and I saw a note in the chat asking what I mean by a professional. And there are a number of process professionals. You can find them on the Cohousing website, although we're still working on getting that directory as populated as we'd like it to be. But people who have some amount of training and some amount of experience of living in community. Pick any large city and there's somebody who does conflict work. Whether or not they understand co-housing is a different thing. So I would say you don't have to have a co-housing person per se. If there's somebody local who does conflict work that works well, that's a reasonable way to go. I would not work with someone who hasn't done consensus work. If you're a consensus or sociocracy community, I would make sure that the professional that you work with is familiar with that. And ideally, I think you want someone who has pretty significant experience with co-housing or intentional community. So, and then you can look at sort of what their training and paradigm is. If you're looking more for structural help, there are people who really their focus has been on, how do you put teams together and put committees together and structure rules around consensus, that kind of thing. If you're looking more on the relational end, there are people who've done more in, you know, my background is imago relationships, so that's my bias. If you really want relational work, I'm a better fit for you than folks who are more organizationally focused. And I'd really encourage you, most of us that do this work have blogs, have, you know, places where you can read what we've written. And there's a fair bit of that in the blog on the cohousing.org website. So that's a good place to go looking for that. And many of us have done web chats. So listen to the web chats. And if it feels like they resonate with what, you know, if you're listening going, yeah, that's what our community needs, that's likely to be a fit. And I would also say, feel free to call any of the professionals, or just, you know, I certainly will spend an hour with any community, and my sense is that the others that do this work would do the same, would happily just spend an hour talking through, how do I work, and what does it cost, and what is the contract, and what am I offering to a community? Does that answer the question about what is a professional? I'm going back to the list, trying to get in order here. Karin, help me if I miss anybody. What is my opinion about having a heart keeper? So my understanding of the term is that that's a job in a meeting structure. So the idea being that there's someone in the meeting that is really, their sole job is to sort of track the emotional temperature of the room and noticing what's going on emotionally. I have mixed feelings about it. I don't think it's a terrible, I mean, ideally everybody would sort of be doing that in a meeting, and anyone could feel free to connect with that. And if there's somebody who's particularly skilled about it that is quite intentional in a meeting, I think that's likely to be helpful and unlikely to hurt anything. I think that that is a poor substitute for having facilitators who are good at that. I think at the end of the day, if your facilitators can't do it, you're likely, it's hard to share that. Like, it's hard for facilitators to make the decisions that they make in a meeting without that information. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea. I do think that it can give sort of unrealistic confidence about what's going on. So does that answer your question? What do you do when there is name calling? So that's from Melanie, and I'm not seeing a picture there. So are we talking about in a meeting?
I'm here. It was actually after a meeting that this happened, and hold on, let me turn on the light so you can see me. It was actually after a meeting that this happened, and it's in a community, but it's not a co-housing community.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of lands in the same space with gossip for me of, you know, it depends on sort of how public it was and who's, you know, I think bringing it up at a whole meeting, if it really happened between two people, is probably, you know, like, you can escalate it in a way that you don't want to. So if it was a pretty small population that heard it, bringing it up with those folks. But I'd be looking for a structured way to have a conversation about it that is really focused on not the, you're not allowed to call people names and that's an evil, horrible thing to do, judgment space, right? You want to be focused on the, when I heard that, I felt. This is the impact it had on me, without making assumptions about the intent, right? You must mean to be putting me down is not particularly useful, but I felt really put down and hurt by that. And to have a structured conversation which that can be received, I think is your most likely solution. I don't tend to put two people together for that conversation. And if I'm facilitating, if I've been asked to facilitate that situation, I do not put two people together in conversation until after I have spoken to each of them individually.
So if someone is mediating, they would caucus with each party before mediating.
I like to have some level of confidence that there is a common ground to seek, right? So the name caller is just so angry that they're saying, really, well, I wanted to hurt their feelings. That was the whole point. I'm not putting that person in the same room with the person who they're trying to hurt and saying I can do something about that. Like, I may work one-on-one with either, okay, this is the situation we're in and where do you want to go with that and how do we get more productive about it? But, you know, I think you really run the risk when you put two people in a room together, you know, hey, I've got this training and I'm a great mediator, so just put any two people in front of me and I'll work that out. I'm not that brave. I wouldn't probably approach it that way. I mean, it can come up in meetings, right, where you're already facilitating and you're in the room with them and it's in real time. And then I do a whole lot of mirroring.
So I'm hearing you say, and you say the word that the person said,
Yep,
whatever the name is.
with the same volume.
With the same.
I usually will put in front of it, and I'm hearing you say that you think. I'm hearing you say that you believe. I'm hearing you say that your perspective is. But name calling is like any, I mean, so think of anything that comes to mind when you hear the word aggression. And I'm going to tell you that's probably a person who doesn't feel heard. And so if they can get heard, like, and again, I'm not talking about whether I think the behavior is okay, right? Do I think name calling is okay? No, I don't think name calling is productive. But I don't get to decide whether that person's going to do name calling. I just get to decide how I respond to it. And if what I want is for what I experience as aggressive behavior to come down, the least likely way for that to happen is for me to call them aggressive in any language imaginable, right? And I think the most likely way to, because what it is that they are triggered and reactive. They are not their best selves. They're not available for connection or relationship, or they wouldn't be acting that way. Like, nobody thinks they're going to get great connection by name calling, right? So if they're doing it, there's something else going on there. And in my opinion, the most likely way to get them to be available for connection and relationship is to get them to feel really thoroughly heard. And if you mirror them in like the calmest imaginable sweet tones, all they feel is
Well, in this case, it actually happened to me. This person called me a name in a private conversation, and I found myself unable to, like, the first thing that came to mind was, are you trying to gaslight me? I don't know what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And in that moment, like, because what happens then is you got triggered very appropriately.
Yeah.
Right. We get triggered. And so I want to be careful that I'm not saying that the person who is on the receiving end of hurtful behavior and is now triggered has a responsibility to behave perfectly. Like, I'm not in any way saying that.
Right.
And if you happen to have the ability at that moment to mirror back what you heard, often it's incredibly powerful. You know, so if someone says, you know, you're a manipulating brat, and you can say back to so what I'm hearing you say is that you think I'm a manipulating brat. Whoa.
I can't remember if I think I may have actually attempted that. I can't remember now because it's hard to remember when you're triggered.
Right. And so, and again, I'm not judging anybody on either side of it or saying that when somebody attacks you, you have to be your best self. It's also perfectly acceptable to sort of say, okay, I'm really triggered right now, I'm gonna walk away. We'll talk about it later. Like,
yeah,
lots of good responses, but I have been pretty stunned by how powerful it is to mirror it back, either as the facilitator or as the receiver, because most of us actually don't want it. We don't really in our hearts want it to land the way that it's likely to. And so we, when we hear it back, that slows it down and we get less triggered. And then we hear what we said and go, wait a minute, let me clean this up. Not 100%, I can't promise you that result, but I think it's the most likely way to get to a space of more connection.
Yeah, I think, thank you.
Sure.
I think you're right.
So I'm looking at the time and the list of questions. Where are we here? And Karen, you're muted, so I'm not.
You didn't hear any of that.
I
Y'all
didn't.
have like 3 or 4 minutes to get your last questions out. Go.
And I'm not seeing any I haven't answered. Are you finding any,
Nope.
Karen? Okay.
That is true.
Okay.
So can I ask a follow-up then if nobody else is asking anything?
Sure.
So, so in this case, I'm thinking about it in terms of structural. It's a group of 5 people that are organizing something, organizing an event. And I have been doing facilitation for the group. And this one person has kind of had, I don't know, a lot of, maybe defensiveness is the only way I can name it.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a conversation in which she couldn't hear, like we couldn't hear each other.
Mm-hmm.
We could not hear each other. It was a separate conversation. And I'm now wondering whether it makes sense to bring it to the group, because the conversation was about the topic that the project is about. And there was disagreement about this topic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a basic foundational disagreement.
Right.
And I'm fine with having the disagreement. I'm not fine with trusting someone who has that opinion of this topic to carry out a project about it. Is that making sense?
I think so. Yeah. So where there's a real foundational disagreement, and it's not, I mean, if we've gotten to name calling, that suggests to me that we are in that emotionally triggered conflict space. Particularly if you've been facilitating consistently, one of the things I'd get curious about is power dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And someone just went to their screen share, and I think you maybe did too, so you probably want to unshare. And so one of the things I'd invite you to think about is whether it would be a good time to have somebody else facilitate for a while. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if you were going to try and bring a topic that you know you're at odds with another person and that there's some heat there, I would definitely not attempt to facilitate the meeting at which that's discussed.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be one piece, and then there may need to be a conversation. I mean, it may be that there's not an alignment of values on this project, and if that's the case, you're way better off to reveal it early and make decisions from there than to get even more invested and further down the road.
That's my concern. That's my concern, is that we're starting, like, the first event of this project is this Saturday, and tomorrow we're finalizing all that needs to be done for that Saturday. And I don't know if this person is committed to the same goals as the group is.
Yeah, it will be difficult to sort that out in the midst of a planning meeting that's got a timeline attached, right?
Yeah, it's a really
that you're doing this week may not be the time for it, but it does sound to me like it's a good, it would be a good time to go back and have a conversation in a structured way about values and what you're trying to do and that kind of thing, and with someone else facilitating.
So what I was thinking of doing, I'll just run this by you if you don't mind.
So actually, I'm gonna pause you right there, but
because you gotta go.
Yes, but I just plugged in Karen's website, so you can follow up with her, as well as her email address and my email address. So she's the one EN, Karen EN, because if you email me, I'll say, oh no, here, talk to Karen. So you're welcome to shoot her an email. Maybe you guys can even find a time to talk on the phone to kind of finish processing some of those questions. So I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. and to say thank you very much, Karen. That was some really useful information. I have to say the piece that I love the most was the thinking about conflict as a way of growth, as a method of growth. I love that, like, shift of perspective. It makes things a little more graceful, I think, sometimes. So thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Again, the WebChat, I plugged it in at the beginning of the chat, the page to the WebChat. So it lists future things as well as links to the recordings of past WebChats. The next one coming up is Wednesday, the 14th, August 14th, same time, 6 p.m. Mountain. Laura Fitch will be talking about design programming. She says that making decisions about architectural design is complicated and potentially stressful. So upfront programming is critical, and she'll talk about some ideas for successful design decision-making. So with that, I urge everybody, if you haven't checked out the shiny new website, please do. And we'll see you all on the 14th. Thank you, everybody.